Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Community Foundation's briefing on building power to effect social change, a discussion about philanthropy's role in effectively supporting community organizing. Thank you all for making the time to join us today. I'm Christina Ciociola, Senior Vice President for Grant Making and Strategy at the Foundation. I'm going to review some webinar housekeeping and then introduce the session today. So all participants are muted and we cannot see you, so don't worry about that. Closed captioning is on. If you want to turn it off, select the CC button on the bottom of your screen. If you're having difficulties, please contact us in the chat, not the Q&A. Carmen Burgos is staff working behind the scenes and she can address any technical issues you might have. So please use the chat for that. Please use the Q&A feature to pose your questions for the panel. I encourage you to enter questions as you have them. You don't need to wait until the Q&A portion of the program, as maybe we'll have an opportunity to ask questions throughout the discussion. We'll see how things emerge organically. We have a number of participants on the line, so if we do not get to your questions during the session, we will make every attempt to follow up with you directly or to include the answers in our follow-up communication to the group, which you will all receive. Please, I asked you to use the chat feature for technical issues. And again, please enter the questions in the Q&A. If you don't put them in the Q&A, we might lose them or we might not see them. We will end on time, and we really appreciate it if you take a few minutes to answer the survey at the end of the webinar. We use these evaluations to improve our programs and identify future topics. There will be a follow-up communication, which will include a link to the recording of the webinar, as well as other useful resources and a recap of the conversation today. I am thrilled that we are able to bring you this timely topic today. We've been talking about bringing this topic to our briefing series for a while. The Foundation has been a longtime supporter of organizations engaging in community organizing. At many points in time, we've been challenged in thinking about how best to support organizations and individuals doing this really important work. I can say thanks to our engagement with the individuals on our panel today, we have learned a lot, and I think we've improved in how we engage with and support community organizing and movement building as an organization. But we can always do better and learn more, which is why I'm so excited to have this group with all of us today. You received some background information on the moderator and panelists in the invite, but I'll do some brief introductions before we get started. I'll start with our moderator, Cesar Aleman. Cesar is the director of the Connecticut Urban Opportunity Collaborative, which is a collaborative working with the three largest community foundations in Connecticut, including our foundation, the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, and Fairfield County's Community Foundation. He is working with us to advance our collective objectives to dismantle racist systems and structures to advance social and economic mobility. We're part of a national cohort of community foundations working together locally and nationally around these issues. And I'm pleased to say that Cesar has the unique distinction of being the first shared staff person that the three foundations have hired together. You can read more about this work and Cesar on our website, but he comes to us with a background that suits him well to moderate this conversation. He has worked as an organizer on many different social justice issues and has worked with the Greater Hartford Interfaith Action Alliance, Grouse-Stein Memorial Fund, and Recenter Race Equity in Education. Next, I'll introduce Kica Matos, who is Vice President of Initiatives at Vera Institute. She's also a former board member and board chair at the Community Foundation. Under Kica's leadership, the Foundation learned a lot about how to effectively support organizing and really ramped up our work in this area, specifically as it was related to immigration integration. Kica is a well-known activist and organizer in New Haven and across the country. Laura McCargar is president of the Perrin Family Foundation, and I believe I'm right when I say she has the distinction of being the first president of the foundation who's not a family member, which is a big deal for a family foundation. Under Laura's leadership, the Perrin Family Foundation focuses on lifting up the voices of youth and organizing. She is also co-chair of a group of funders in Connecticut known as Supporting Organizing Work Connecticut. This is a group that's on a journey together to more effectively support organizing work. And I can say as a funder, we are grateful to have Laura leading us on this journey together with all of our colleagues across the state. And finally, we have Lorenzo Jones, who's co-founder and co-executive director of the Katal Center for Equity, Health, and Justice. Katal works in Connecticut and New York to strengthen the people, movements, policies, and institutions that advance equity, health, and justice for everyone. Lorenzo is an organizer with more than 25 years of experience organizing communities and has coached hundreds of grassroots leaders. He is someone who thinks very deeply about the intersection of organizing and philanthropy. He has organized and authored several articles and opinion pieces on this very subject, which we will include as resources in our follow-up communication. I'll now pass it off to Cesar to get us started. Thank you all again for joining us, and please remember to use the Q&A feature for questions and to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. Thank you. Cesar?
Yes, thank you so much, Christina, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to give a special thanks to the team that was able to put this together and who has been supporting us today. We have an exciting conversation and a great group of panelists to help us guide the discussion. As we think about how to effectively engage in supporting community organizing work, I think we would do well to spend some time building some common and shared understanding of what community organizing is, especially as it relates to building power to affect social change, something which we are all familiar with doing and supporting in various different ways and methods. And so one of the things that I think oftentimes happens is that we sometimes conflate multiple methods. Because they work in tandem or work together, and oftentimes are employed by the same groups as different tactics to build power and affect change. Oftentimes what that can look like is social services. It can look like community development. It can look like education and research, as well as electoral engagement, impact litigation, activism and advocacy, and community organizing. Now, all of these methods are important and effective in building power to affect change. And some of them we all, as I said, use in tandem as community organizers, as activists, as other members leading for change. But there are some differences between them that are really key, specifically when it comes to how much or how little conflict is present in each of them. Conflict is central to some of these methods in order to be able to build the type of power that we need to be able to create change. But even in the methods that have conflict present, conflict does not necessarily look the same. Conflict can look different in electoral engagement, for example, where conflict exists at the polls or in the voting ballots. In impact litigation, conflict shows up in the court system. And in advocacy, that can show up in the legislature. When it comes to community organizing, conflict is central to the way that community organizing builds power. And it uses conflict as a central method to achieve social change. This is a good opportunity to think and talk about the way that community organizing works and how we understand it to be effectively engaged in our spaces. So in community organizing, we're building a base. That means that we are building it on relationships. There is no relationship without conflict. Conflict allows us to understand where people stand. But most importantly, it allows us to understand what people stand for. And in doing so, we are able to align shared interests to think about the ways in which we're going to move in doing work together. Conflict is inevitable, and in the work of organizing, it's very much necessary. So it incorporates a space where we also allow leadership to develop. Community organizers are about identifying leaders and helping develop leaders. In order to be able to do that effectively, what I understand to be true is that we need to do and follow the iron rule, not to do for others what they can do for themselves. And so this allows people to really take action and take ownership of the way that they move into the work. It really also gives us an opportunity to think about the way in which we move into the work by building power. It allows for opportunities for leaders to be able to identify specific issues that they want to work on. In organizing, there are no permanent allies and no permanent enemies, which really makes relationships crucial and important. because those are the places where we align ourselves around specific things that we stand for. There's a lot of different things about organizing that separate it from the other methods of social change that are needed. And they all participate together to create the atmosphere that is necessary to build the types of movements that can create effective long-term systemic changes. Today, we're going to learn more about them so that we can learn how philanthropy can better support them. I'm going to now turn it over to Kica to introduce herself. And Kica, you have been someone who has been leading and effectively creating social change in using many of these methods. What are the pieces of community organizing that you think are really crucial to lift up and to talk about today?
Thank you, Cesar. It's really good to be here, particularly with such an esteemed panel. And I just want to give a shout out to the Community Foundation for having this conversation. I think far too often, philanthropic organizations shy away from supporting social justice change and funding movements because they are sometimes seen as a little scary or intimidating, or inevitably people say, if you fund social justice, you're going to piss off some big donor. So a big shout out to the Community Foundation. And thank you for politely telling me I'm old, Cesar. I appreciate you've been around for a long time. The truth is, yes, I've been around for a long time. I've done social justice work for 30 years. I started off as a community organizer, then went to law school, and then used my skills as a lawyer to do movement work. I both represented people on death row and also did advocacy in the criminal legal system. I've been an advocate for a long time, and I not only work at the Vera Institute, which focuses on ending mass incarceration in the context of the criminal legal system and immigrant rights, but I've done a fair bit of agitation in New Haven because this is where I live. And I want to make sure that I do everything I can to make my own community better. To your question, I just have a couple of observations about movement building, social justice movements. And then I just want to make a couple of very brief points. The first is that social justice movements, we must always remember they make the impossible possible. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we look historically at how our entire world has changed for the better, it's been because of social justice movement. And I'm going to mention just a few in a historic context, right? The abolition fight, right, to end slavery in this country and around the world, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, right? All of the victories in all of these contexts were because people put their bodies on the line, right? Because a great and growing coalition of people realized that they needed to step up and do something to fight for deep change. And so I'm always a great believer that even if the fight seems hard, we can look back at history and see how social justice movements have really transformed not just this country, but the world. Having said that, and I think this message I want to really particularly deliver for funders and for folks who are on the call who are not new to the social justice world, these things take time, right? And so when you think about supporting social justice movements, either as a donor or as somebody who wants to step up and join the fight, we have to remember that we must be patient because social justice movements take time. Why? Because most of these movements are actually led by people who are most impacted. And in order to make sure that we elevate and raise the voices of not just those most impacted, but their allies as well, it takes a lot of what I say boots on the ground, organizing, training, education, and all of those things take time. Related to that, I would say, the other thing we have to think about is that social justice movements sometimes move very slowly, but there are some incremental changes. And I'll give a few modern day examples. I think about the immigrant rights movement. I've been steeped in the immigrant rights movement now for 20 years. We want to see changes in federal law that still haven't come about. But I want to point to a recent victory of not too long ago of the fight for DACA, right? To make sure that young people known as Dreamers, are able to remain in the United States free from deportation and with work permits. Right, that is a victory of the immigrant rights movement, but we are still not we have not arrived at what I call the promised land. I think about the racial justice struggle, which still continues and most recently has gotten a lot of movement energy from the Black Lives Matter, right? But for the movement, for not just for Black lives, for racial justice, I'm not sure that we would have had the societal reckoning that we had after the murder of George Floyd, right? We can credit that to movements. And then the last thing I will say before I turn it back over to you, Cesar, is that we should always expect that there are setbacks in our fight for social justice movements. I think about the LGBTQ fight for marriage equality, right? That was not a straight and easy path, right? There was a fight for LGBTQ rights, and then there were a lot of fights that actually took place in the courtroom, right? And so sometimes you take one step forward and then you find that you take 2 steps backwards because of changes in the law or because of legal changes. And part of what makes social justice movement so important is that if you organize, right, you're able to continue the fight. And so I always say to people, be patient. If there is a setback, you regroup, but one of the things you need to keep doing is to continue to grow movements and recruit people and encourage people to speak out. I'll put myself on mute. I hope that was helpful.
That was great. Thank you, Kica. And I think you lifted up something that's really important, which is recognizing that this is long-term work because systems change requires a long time to happen. And that's why community organizing is one of the most effective strategies and methods to do this work, is because it allows for that power to build over time. I want to turn it to Laura to hear from you what other pieces we need to highlight. And welcome, Laura. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you again so much for having me. Laura McCargar, I'm the president of the Perrin Family Foundation, which supports youth organizing work in the state of Connecticut. This has been the focus of the foundation's work for the past 10 years. And when the Perrin Foundation committed its mission to supporting this kind of work, it was then and remains the only foundation in the state of Connecticut explicitly and intentionally committed to focusing on the process of organizing, not around a particular issue, not around a particular policy, but investing in the people power and the infrastructure necessary to advance organizing work. And I want to highlight that because if we're talking about definitions and frameworks for understanding organizing, we can't talk about organizing without talking about power. Organizing work is fundamentally about shifting relationships of power and building the power of the people to challenge the status quo that are upheld and perpetuated in systems and structures. So I think whenever we talk about organizing, we have to name and acknowledge power in the room. And that's a tricky and complex conversation, I think, to have from the seat of philanthropy, because there is so much power inherent in the access of the mass of resources and wealth that philanthropy has, and the way that can be used kind of to influence work. I'm really delighted to be having this conversation hosted by the Community Foundation and with so many donors on the line, because another important aspect and component, I think, of organizing work is around truth-telling and accountability. Organizing work is, you can't achieve the kind of change that Cesar and Kica have been talking about without holding folks in positions of power to account. And we have a lot of accounting to do in the sector of philanthropy. And the truth of the matter is that so much of the incredible organizing work that has happened in the state of Connecticut has happened in spite of philanthropy's support, not because of philanthropy's support. Right. And I think that's something that we're going to be able to unpack a little bit more here so that we can talk about what it means for philanthropy to show up in right relationship with organizing work. And that I'll say has been a big part of our work at the Perrin Foundation working in collaboration with other funders through Supporting Organizing Work Connecticut, which is a collaborative of more than 17 foundations around the state, working together to strengthen the infrastructure for organizing work around the state. You know, I think it was actually, I need to acknowledge, it was at a one-on-one training I went to when I was 22 years old, actually ironically run in the very office that I sit in today by Lorenzo Jones, which is what introduced me to the concept of organizing and what that is and what it means. At the time, I was running a youth organization and a youth program. And I think one of the fundamental things that it's important for people to understand about organizing work is that there's a distinction between mobilizing people to show up and, you know, use their voice in support of a specific issue, and fundamentally building power in a broad base of constituents that you are accountable to. And so that kind of organizing method and grounding, that it's about being accountable to a base, I think is also a core principle of organizing work, and something that I think as organizing and I would say movement action, mass action and protest has captured the public attention in a way over the past, you know, decade in ways that it hadn't before as a result of the police violence and murder of Black people in this country. A lot of, I think, folks see the mass action, but don't understand always the work that goes into building an informed and accountable base. And I guess the other final thing I would add is that as Lorenzo has written in some of the articles he's talked about, you know, there's organized people and there's organized money. And too often, right, money actually works, organized money works at odds with the goals and outcomes that folks that are organizing are working towards. And so some of our work and our role, in fact, the reason why I moved from running a youth organization on the ground into philanthropy was to play an active role in organizing the money and the resources to be in service of, rather than in conflict with, the efforts for racial and social justice being led by people on the ground.
Thank you so much, Laura. A lot to think about, and I think really good pieces of information that we can jump into when we move to our next part. I want to recognize that you actually lifted up something that's really important, and I want to name it as we move into Lorenzo's introduction, which is that, you know, this work really is about power and power shifting and recognizing and naming power in the room. And as I'm sitting here moderating this panel, it's not lost on me that we are a panel of philanthropists and we have a grantee. And inherently, there is a power dynamic as we think about doing this work here today, where we are asking grantees to come in and share with us and do that very important work that Laura was naming, which is really the truth telling and the accountability piece. And really thinking about how do we actually do that authentically in relationship with others in order to be able to actually build the type of relationships and power that's needed to do the kind of work that we're talking about. And so I'm grateful that Lorenzo's here, and I'm excited to hear how he helps us round out this as we think about the ways that we can effectively engage in this work. Lorenzo, to you.
No, thanks for that. So you actually helped me with an opening. So to your point about being like the only grantee on here, you know, I was born on the south side of Chicago, 71, right? So in the words of the immortal Bernie Mac, I ain't scared of you, mother. Grantee or not, like I want all the smoke. So Lorenzo Jones, longtime organizer. I started out in AHOP in 1991 in Asylum Hill. My youngest brother, both my younger brothers were living with me. I was about, 18, 19. But both my younger brothers had come to live with me. This whole situation with my mom's. And my youngest brother, Gerald, ended up joining the youth program and working in like the summer youth program at AHOP. And he was able to do that because I lived at 1021 Asylum Ave. And so a lot of other stuff's going on at that time. because he's part of that program and he's living with me, they have me listed as a parent. At that time, Marie Kirkley Bay is part of the leadership team of the Asylum Hill Organizing Project. And the Asylum Hill Organizing Project is run by like all Black women, like everybody. The ED is a Black woman, the director of senior programming is a Black woman, the head of organizing, lead organizer is a Black woman, the person who drives the van to pick people up, to take them to all those meetings were Black women. The board was all Black women. And back then, like I came in, they called me because they wanted to put together a parents group. And they called all the parents who had kids in the summer youth program, a group called PAVE. The organizer was Luwania Martin. And by that time I had moved from 1021 to 950 Asylum Ave. Still had my brothers with me. I had another brother with me, but by that time I had my sister and a niece with me. We were all in like a one-bedroom apartment at Midtown Apartments. And Luwania calls me to do a 101. This is why 101s are so important to me. I have done two things in my life, well, three, two appropriate things to talk about, right? Is drug dealing and community organizing. So I am a full-fledged 5 Rockwaller, right, drug dealer in Asylum Hill in Hartford and Connecticut, like with an expansive network that at that time that's in the process of growing, right? From Shelby, North Carolina to K-Town, Chicago to Ohio, Virginia, all the regular spots. So I am completely not, like I'm watching TV at night thinking I should give money to like Sally Struthers, like because some kid had a fly on his eyeball. Like that's where my mind is at that time. And Luwania does a one-on-one with me because she's building a group called Parents Against Violent Environments, PAVE, Parents Against Violent Environments. So I start out as a community leader. Literally within 2 weeks of that one-on-one, I'm at the state capitol. I've been a registered lobbyist in the state of Connecticut since 1983. I've worked every single legislative session, every single year in Connecticut since then. That's like a little of my history. I start off at AHOP, I go to UCAN, United Connecticut Action for Neighborhoods. I'm there for 13 years. I'm trained by Jack Mimnar, out to Lash. I helped to build what was called the Caring Families Coalition, the Brothers Group. I'm the Broken Windows organizer in Hartford. So I'm the one doing the block clubs and comprehensive community partnerships. I chaired the meeting of all 17 neighborhoods of Hartford for like 8 years on the 4th Thursday of every month, which was the meeting of the Broken Windows Coalition, and trained community organizers across the Bureau of Justice Assistance for the Fed. So, right, whatever, right? Judge Norco, who did the community court, he performed my wedding. May he rest in peace. So like I'm in 10 grand. I shift in 2005. I leave UCAN in 2005. I take over a Better Way Foundation. We run the Crack and Powder Cocaine campaign and a Ban the Box, Clean Slate, all those bills we run from 2005 to 2012. When Malloy comes in, he and NAACP and other groups kind of move into that space. They push kind of like the network that had been built out. And Malloy runs what you all know as the criminal justice reform work in Connecticut, but that's built on my work. When that happened, I shift and start to work with Laura at Perrin Foundation, and we begin to build what you all know as Block, and the Block grantees and the youth organizing in the state. Parallel to that is a bunch of international work, blah, 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 United Nations stuff. And so circle back 2015, I launched Katal. Katal's home headquarters is 30 Laurel Street in Hartford at the United Way building. Got an office in Brooklyn. Prior to COVID, offices in Amsterdam and Albany. Right now in New York, we ran the Less is More campaign, Less is More New York campaign, which parole reform. We're going to run the same thing in Connecticut, and we've got our next coalition, our next campaign, Shut Invest, to launch, which is about closing closing prison facilities, adult and juvenile, shuttering them and reinvesting that money back in the programs right across the social safety net. I'll say the last thing and stop. To the point that Laura was making, like, so here's the rule, right? Katal is based on two things. The iron rule, we don't do for people what they could do for themselves. Second is the core principle of harm reduction, right? We meet people where they are without judgment, but we don't lead them there. We take those two pillars and apply that through a regimented civic engagement training strategy where we build people's confidence in being civically engaged locally. All politics are local. We build from the ground up. It's why we were able to override gubernatorial vetoes during that stretch of time I'm in at Better Way Foundation, because all those campaigns were built from municipalities up. The community foundations were not interested in that strategy because it was against the drug war, and most community foundations were subsidizing municipal and city programming money every summer. So we built an entire network outside of the NAACP, outside of the Black churches, outside of the community foundations. And that's what you're witnessing from 2002 to 2012 in Connecticut. All the foundations and the NAACP, all these other people come on when the governor comes on in 2011 and 12 with Malloy. You all run that, whatever y'all doing with him. All the rest of us are over here trying to figure out how to, a lot of organizations die. We take a Better Way Foundation, we strip it down to the 501c3, and we turn it over to Black and brown women, youth organizers at that time, right, who were looking to have independence, fiscal sponsorship, and independence. Is why most of you all who fund youth organizing groups like that in the state, if you're funding those groups, you're probably funding those groups through a Better Way Foundation. That's the same Better Way Foundation that we ran that entire campaign through. So I'll stop there. The last thing I'll say is to be clear about the rule. Power comes in two forms: organized money and organized people. Organized people will always beat organized money. It's called revolution. Because that's true, it is nature, right? Organized money as a primary objective to any goal it sets is to disorganize people. It's why people will be having a meeting and they'll be going great and they'll be cleaning their block club and they'll be cleaning the street up and the kids will be playing and the police will come by with a hoop it up thing and whatever, a barbecue grill. And as soon as that same block club gets a grant for $500, everybody say, we were doing fine until the money showed up. Organized people, power comes in two forms: organized money and organized people. The Democratic machine, the Democrat Party, the political machine, that is not organized people. That is organized money. So I'll throw it back to you. So we believe in civic engagement versus, one last thing, civic engagement versus political involvement. You want to be politically involved? Go join the NAACP. If you want to be civically engaged, run with us.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I think that this opens up, an opportunity. It was important for us to really get a good grasp and grounding on what community organizing is and what it's meant to do and how it does it, so that we could better understand how to support it. And I think that what I've heard from Kica and Laura and Lorenzo today opens up the door to also look at an opportunity for us to reflect on what philanthropy has traditionally done, or what common mistakes maybe we have had in the past supporting this type of work. One of the things that I heard from you, Kica, was talking about really having that patience to recognize that this is long-term work and that means it requires a long-term investment. And then Laura and Lorenzo, I think that you both are speaking also at how organized money specifically can come sometimes at odds and actually disorganize people. And so as we look to move forward and think about how to support organizing work, it's really important for us as philanthropy to think about how we are organizing money. And so I want to open it up to the panel to reflect on those two things as we really begin to think about how to move away and learn from our mistakes and the things we have done to find new ways of doing and being in this work that really support and build the type of movements we want. And I will turn it to anyone who has an immediate response to that.
Cesar, I think we're all polite. I suggest you just be Socratic from now on. Otherwise, there's going to be long pauses.
I agree. It's up to you, Kica. That was a perfect segue.
So a couple of thoughts, and Lorenzo and Laura have already mentioned these, but I, as I reflect on the struggle that it has been for movement organizations to get money, I would just make a few observations. One is that there is a distinction between those who are doing the work on the ground often and those who do the best job at presenting in front of funders. And I often reflect on the organizations that have really robust social media and a communications machinery and very polished leaders with access to powerful people. And I would just encourage philanthropic organizations to do the homework of really getting a sense of which organizations on the ground that are doing social justice work and that growing movement are actually having an impact, and figure out the quickest, easiest way to get resources to them to be able to do the work that they need. So I would say one thing. The other thing that I would say, and this is reflected or connected to an earlier comment I made about social justice movements taking time, there are sometimes these metrics that foundations ask for that just do not translate into organizing. And so sometimes when you get money from funders, they say, well, show us the metrics. Give us these numbers, produce the research. And it's not always easy for movement organizations beyond saying, well, we're in these number of communities, we've done X number of trainings for movement, for organizations with a membership who can say we've grown the membership by X amount. It is important to get resources to organizations that are having impact and have faith that they know what they're doing with their money to produce the kind of movement building that is so critical.
You actually got muted, so I just wanted to let you know.
Sorry, thank you. And so I do think it's important to try to get resources to the organizations that are having impact without making these organizations and these leaders go through these hurdles and hoops to try to match metrics that just don't make sense in the context of social justice movements. And then the last thing I would say is it is important, and Laura talked about this, right? When you do movement building, a lot of it is providing people on the ground who are most deeply impacted with the tools to be able to become leaders. And that takes training, right? And that takes real investment in people to be able to lead social justice movement. And so I do think something else I just want to emphasize is the importance of funding trainings for people, movement building trainings, organizer trainings, to really create resources to also be able to do movement building retreats and gatherings where you are bringing people power together to engage in the kind of visioning and planning that happens when you bring brilliant minds together to be able to figure out what the next phase of the fight is.
Thank you so much, Kica. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Kica. I'll jump in. I'm noticing the question in chat. It might have been directed at Lorenzo about the 2 pillars, but one was meet people where they are, but don't leave them there. And the second actually was don't do for that I want to speak to, particularly in the context of philanthropy, is don't do for others what they can do for themselves. And I think with deep respect, right, both to the family that I work for, the Perrin family, and to donors on the call, we have to understand that that rule that is fundamental to organizing success is fundamentally at odds with how we've been trained to think about what philanthropy is, right? So often philanthropy is about, I am going to give X, Y, or Z because these folks are unable to do so themselves. So part of doing the homework on social justice to support social justice is actually doing that inward look at ourselves, at philanthropy. Supporting this work requires us to fundamentally rethink what we think we know about how change happens and about what success looks like, right? We are accustomed in the philanthropic sector or as donors, we want to see impact. We want to know that the dollars that we have made a difference. And if folks have shifted, evolved, right, their thinking to appreciate that there are deeply rooted systemic barriers and obstacles, white supremacy and institutional racism being one of them, that stand in the way of changing the landscape of opportunity and the conditions for everyday people. We also, right, sometimes think that with the dollars, the resources, the influence and access, right, that philanthropy has, we can hop over to the part where we just get the policy change done, right? So effective support for organizing work not only recognizes that this work takes time, but that we fundamentally do not have the answers, right? We do not have the fixes and we do not have the solves. And part of the reason why Lorenzo mentioned the Perrin Foundation has run the initiative that it has, Building Leadership and Organizing Capacity, which helped to build infrastructure for organizing work across the state, that is generating the leadership, the young leadership that is now populating other leading social justice organizations, is because there was a need for a space for people to come together and to be in relationship with one another, to be able to build the analysis and strategy to work and think collectively. And philanthropy, that's something we're often very uncomfortable with. We want to fund people to do things, not to be together, right? The long-term nature of the investment required is so critical. If we think about this through a financial lens, right? Anyone that's managed an endowment or anyone that's looking for investment on their returns, know you have to let the money sit and you have to let the money grow sometimes. The impact of the compounded, the compounded interest and gains, that's what delivers, right? The growth, right, of your assets. We don't do that in our philanthropic work for organizing. We give folks a 1-year grant and expect to see a movement shift with an update on a quarterly basis, right? We have to fundamentally rethink both how we're defining success and the duration and scope and length of our investment. And then I think the final thing is that we have to stay in our lane as donors and as institutional philanthropy. And staying in our lane, again, means that we're not choosing what we think is important. We're not choosing the change that we think ought to occur, right? I'll stop there and want to make sure that Lorenzo has time to add.
No, y'all covered it. Huh? What I would have to say is probably an answer to a different question. I'm just waiting for the question to come up.
So ask the question, Lorenzo. What is the question?
No, I have an answer to a question that hasn't been asked yet. I just know it's coming. So I just want to wait.
Okay.
So organize it.
Well, so what I'm hearing also as we're going through this is thinking about the way that all of these things interact with one another, is recognizing that this is not a linear path, right? And Laura, I think that both you and Kica were speaking to this. So I've heard a lot about the types of things that we can do in order to be able to effectively shift and change some of the things to support this work. What is the work that's happening right now in Connecticut that needs support? And so thinking about the work that you each are doing in your spheres, Lorenzo, I'll start with you since you spoke a bit about the work that Katal is doing.
So in organizing, we'll do something like we distinguish problems from issues. We do a thing called issue cuts. So problems in Connecticut right now, right? Public ops, like we talk about is like, access to affordable healthcare or equal access to affordable healthcare, but that kind of gets cut into issues like the public option stuff that's happening. Katal's doing our stuff, obviously around not just criminal justice reform, but specifically like putting like robust capacity into like leadership development and coaching and like hand-holding, behind the scenes in a lot of cases. So a lot of that stuff's not public. So like somebody, I think Kica was saying earlier around training, right? The thing I totally agree with that. And I would dovetail that by saying, like, one of the things at Katal we do, everybody goes to management center training. When you get here, 3 months, when you hit your 3 months, you do undoing racism training, whatever identity and like gender training is out there, and you do management center training, and you got to read the book, Getting Things Done. It's just part of your onboarding. Like, you could be doing a great job outdoor knocking and flyering. You're not going to stay here if you don't complete those trainings, right? Because it lays a foundation for the language, it lays a foundation around expectations and so forth. To me, like, that's got to be in Connecticut, that's got to be something where like we have a calendar, right? This is something that's more appropriate for philanthropy, in my opinion, right? You don't win for another rule I'll share with you, and I'll stop. You don't win because out to top means you don't win because you are right, you win because you are strong. And so the programmatic approach to like, we're going to treat all these grantees like really like they're our foot soldiers, and they're doing their bidding as part of our larger strategy to maintain our access to the political system. That's pimping, right? And what we're describing, we're saying, like, just because you're right, just because you know the right thing, just because you have all the information, like, you're not doing anybody, or you have all the money, you're not doing anybody any favors. You're actually undermining some of the most vulnerable people to take the biggest, most public risk with their reputations, with their money, with their families, with their safety, right? To do something, and ostensibly what you're saying to them is that because I gave you a check, right, and because I know what you should be doing, here's what I have a right to expect of you. If you don't, I don't get that back from you, I get to force you all to compete with each other over getting that from me. And then I get to stand back and be like, I don't know why they don't get along. Organized money disorganizes people. I'm kind of a little bit all over the place to answer your question, but like, Katal, like, our thing here is not just campaigns, like teaching this analysis, teaching this regimen, building out something that's repeatable and shareable and that's robust, that prioritizes accountability and leadership development, not just in the field with organizers, but also, which is different, the space of philanthropy.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I see several head nods from both Kica and Laura. If you want to jump on and add that, something to what Lorenzo just mentioned. And then I do want to note that we're getting questions from from the viewers as well. And so we'll make a couple minutes to answer those also. Kica, I'll turn it to you. You were nodding your head.
Yeah, I just really appreciating Lorenzo's analysis and the wisdom that he's sharing with all of us. Look, in terms of social justice struggles happening, just yesterday there was a rally, not just in the New Haven Green, but around the state, around childcare, supporting childcare providers, and also setting aside resources to make sure that not just childcare providers, but there are significant resources set aside for this important issue. So that's an easy one. The criminal legal system reform, we still have a huge problem in the nation, including in Connecticut, around mass incarceration, right? We are sadly a global leader in the world in terms of the number of people who are incarcerated. And if you just take a quick glance at the numbers, just the racism and the classism that you see in terms of the people who are incarcerated is pretty repulsive and disgusting. I know there's an effort right now going on and started it picked up a lot of steam last year around ending solitary confinement, which is an affront to human rights. The fight for immigrant rights, we were really hoping that after the terrible impact of Trump over 4 years to really advance hate and to advance a xenophobic agenda and encourage people to engage in violence against immigrants, particularly immigrants of color, that the Biden administration would come in and wipe away a lot of that. And sadly, that still hasn't happened, right? Just a few months ago, we saw a border patrol on horses whipping Haitian migrants, right? The happening today under a progressive administration. And we still are treating particularly undocumented immigrants like garbage. So that fight is still going on. I mean, all you have to do, and somebody asked in the chat line, how do you do your homework? Watch the news, use our friend Google, go on Facebook, talk to people, right? Talk to people in your community, who's actually doing what, because these ecosystems, I will say, are really small. Just earlier, Cesar and I had a conversation about somebody that Cesar knew, that he said, oh, this person knows you. These ecosystems are small, right? I can bet you that if anybody on this who's joining us today had a question about movement building around criminal justice in Connecticut, and they heard about somebody, they could call Lorenzo and say, Lorenzo, do you know this person? I would bet my house that Lorenzo would not only know that person, but would have a point of view about that person. It doesn't take that much time, right, to look around and figure out what social justice struggles are happening and who's engaged in them. Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Kica. I just want to lift and name, I think by way of example, or just use this opportunity to name what I think is actually a field sector challenge. In the beginning, in the introduction, you heard Lorenzo walk down some of his organizing history, origin story, and lineage, right? Part of what has happened is that philanthropy, right, or other folks in elected positions of power often claim, right, hold and own the narrative around how change happens, how we got here, right? So the organizing history that was shared on this call is critical, because actually it's never been invested in and uplifted. So I'm really appreciating this question about what does successful work look like, or what work is happening on the ground now, because there is so much, like there is literally so much, and in the face of so much, right, there is still such scant support from the philanthropic sector. I'll name an example, right? Everyone knows the impact that the murder of George Floyd had on finally pushing so many folks in philanthropy toward the step of being able to name and directly address racism, right? It took to that point for that to happen. And yet, right, and we have had more than 10 people of color, Black people and people of color, murdered by police in Connecticut. Let's just be clear, right? And yet, if any of the folks, and there are many working on those issues, wanted to go to a foundation for resources, they would have no door to walk through, because it's not the issue priority area. They don't live in the right city, right? They don't have C3 status. They don't have 3 years of documented financial history or investments, right? Or accounting records, right? So I think that is, there's so much work happening. And actually, yeah.
Can I say one more thing? And they actually don't care about your feelings.
That's right.
They care about their neighbor just got murdered. So they're not going to show up hat in hand asking for help. They're going to show up like frustrated because no one will help.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I think that's the final thing, right? Is that movements will always be, organizers will always be ahead of philanthropy. They will always be ahead of philanthropy. And so our job, our homework is to figure out, number one, to stay out of the way, right? Stay out of the way enough that we're not stepping on or over the change agenda that they have. And two, I really want to emphasize and highlight what Lorenzo said, not just thinking through the lens of campaigns, but thinking through the lens of infrastructure, right? Katal runs an organizer roundtable that brings together organizers across issue, across geography, across constituency every month. Those are the kinds of spaces that are necessary to help build the power and muscle, the collective power and muscle of folks in Connecticut. And when it's done that way, name a quick example. Lorenzo and I worked together years ago when he was leading a campaign to equalize sentencing disparities for crack and powder cocaine in Connecticut. It was the first state in the country to pass that legislation. And it did so overriding a gubernatorial veto. And it did so in an organizing strategy that threaded Black communities and white rural and suburban communities across the state of Connecticut. And not once, right, has that fundamental structural shift in one of the most egregious examples of codified racism been challenged, right? Because of the sustained power that it built to deliver that kind of change, right? And so if that is the lasting kind of impact that we want, we also have to think about how we're not just investing in campaigns that will get to a policy outcome, but how we're investing in the sustained infrastructure that is going to sustain and build the power necessary to tackle these issues, tackle these challenges regardless of issue.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about the elephant in the room here. CJTS. It is not the field's job. It is not our job to come up with what to do with the kids there. The people have PhDs, they got billions of dollars, they got consultants, they have infrastructure, they got capacity, they got administration, they got everything they need to answer the question, to turn to the field and say, accept the fact that we're going to reopen a child prison. That's going to come down to how y'all show up here as philanthropy across the field, and the difference in who y'all are and who the field is going to show up real fast, right? It is going to be a defining moment. In my experience, these type of things are defining moments for philanthropy, right? About how y'all going to show up here when we have to say to young Black women that the Black woman who was elected vice president of the United States of America came here personally and asked us to reopen a child prison. That happened to us, y'all. That happened to us. And I'm gonna buy as many pair of Chuck Taylors as I can afford for little girls who gonna have to wear them on the way back into CJTS. It ain't my job to figure out what to do with them. That's what we got a commissioner and all these departments for. It ain't yours either. But it ain't yours to try to make us figure out how to answer that question either.
So we have a lot that we have covered today, and I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our viewers today for joining us. And I think, Lorenzo, you're giving us a lot to think about. We're walking away here with some concrete things that we can do and think about as we think about how to continue to support this work. And what's clear to me is that as we continue to move into this, we need to embrace conflict, and we need to think about how we are going to be showing up over the course of the next decades in order to be able to do this. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christina so she can close us out. But I do want to take a moment to express a lot of gratitude again to all of our panelists for taking the time and sharing all of your knowledge and your insights and your knowledge with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Christina now.
Thank you, Cesar, and thank you all so much for this really informative conversation. I appreciate each of you, and I'm seeing a note in the chat that says we need a part 2 to this conversation, and that might be the case. But this was a really wonderful start, and again, thank you all. For those folks who are on the line, you will receive a follow-up communication from us with a link to the recording, as well as a summary of the discussion and other resources. And we'll try to address some of the unanswered questions in the chat in that follow-up communication as well. Again, thank you all. Don't forget to fill out the survey at the end, because that helps us direct our future briefings and topics. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.